So as stated before, my name is Chad Page. I'm currently the sheep and goat specialist here at Utah State University. I do a lot of teaching here on campus and have a really good time kind of doing what I love. But today I wanted to take some time and talk to us about backyard predator control for poultry and small ruminants. Now, I've a lot more experience dealing with the small ruminant side of things, sheep and goats, but also go ahead and try to tackle some of these poultry issues that we talk about. Okay, so kind of focusing more on those two things, even though some of the things that we talk about management wise can be shared into, if you own rabbits or some other type of backyard animal and how to protect them from some of these predators that can be similar across our different animals. So just to kind of put this into perspective, okay, the impact that predators can have on animals. There was a really good study, and this is done with cows, so it's not necessarily our urban backyard setting, but I wanted to point out some pictures from this study that was done in 2013. They took two groups of cows. One of them, a group of cows that had never experienced the devastation of predators, in this case, wolves, okay? And then they took a group of cows that had been out on rangeland in the forest where there were a lot of wolves in Oregon, okay? What I want to point out is the difference in the disposition of these animals and how stressed they are when we mimic the presence of a wolf. In this case, we introduced a German Shepherd, okay? You can see that those cows that had seen wolves before were very excited, okay? They were nervous, high anxiety, whereas the cows that had never experienced wolves before, they were much more calm. They weren't grouped together. They weren't as frightened. And I think this goes across our animals as we're trying to be the best producers we can. It shows how much of an impact that these predators can have on our animals, even down to stories that my next door neighbor was telling me that a dog ate one of his chickens and his chickens have stopped laying for the last 2 weeks. Okay. So production goes down. The amount of gain we get on an animal or production that we get out of an animal can be affected purely out of the presence of a predator or the impact that predator has on our animals. Okay. So what is a predator? So really, a predator is an organism that primarily obtains food by killing and consuming other organisms. Okay, so there are many. We have snakes, okay, skunks, raccoons are all pretty common ones that we think of. Here in the West, grizzly bears, as we're thinking about maybe some bigger ranches, not necessarily here in Salt Lake or hopefully not in our local communities or in our backyards. But nonetheless, they're still a giant predator. Raptors, okay, so this could be different hawks or owls could prey on our animals. In some essence, maybe even parasites would fit into this category, right? What kind of parasites are you dealing with? Maybe even in your backyard flock, you're dealing with mites or things like that. Those can be things to think about, okay? But one that's often overlooked is Fido, right? As we look at some of our loving neighborhood dogs and things like that, sometimes these can be the worst predators of them all. And we'll talk about these as we get into it. Kind of first going into, I'm going to give some kind of stats on the industries and kind of how that bring it back into our small farm backyards. But there aren't a lot of studies done with backyard chickens or backyard sheep and goats. And so it can be kind of hard to see the stats of it or studies designed for those, since most of that is based around commercial industry. But if we look back 2010, it kind of looked at the different animals that were predating on sheep in this case. And you can see that there's quite a few of them, right? We have bears, bobcats, coyotes, dogs, mountain lions, foxes, wolves, eagles, unknown predators, other predators, okay? And recently in Utah, There's been the first Wolverine sighting, and we're all really excited about that. However, it was sighted with its first kill on sheep. Okay, so one more predator onto this list. Okay, but far and away in the sheep and goat industry, coyotes are the biggest issue. Okay, about 60% of the death loss that we see in the sheep industry is due to coyotes. Now, this stat doesn't necessarily play true for our backyards, right? So keep that in mind. But if you wanted to see the impact, and so you can start thinking this of your own farm, how much money have you put into your chickens before they start laying? How much economic loss would you have if you did have a predator come in? Okay. In Utah in 2020, okay, there were roughly 26,000 sheep or lambs lost to predators. 62% of that 26,000 was from coyotes alone. Okay. That estimated dollar value to the sheep industry was over $3 million. Okay. It'd be interesting if we could try to put this data together to see how much loss there is just by the chickens alone in our backyard that are preyed upon by hawks or other things. If we looked at, our friendly wild coyote here, the coyote range has really spread across the years. In the 1800s, late 1800s, that range was fairly narrow across the US. However, coyotes and now some hybrids of coyotes are doing really well in some even urban environments. Where I grew up in Chandler, Arizona, which is now pretty heavy populated with people. It was kind of on the outskirts of town when I grew up there. We would get coyotes that would come in a lot off the desert, and they would prey on our poultry and sometimes kill our sheep, but mainly taking chickens and things like that. Now, this is kind of something that is somewhat controversial, dealing with coyotes if you're in an area where coyotes might be a problem. Coyotes respond very well to hunting and overall population density. So here's a graph here in the middle showing the coyote population response to control. Okay, so this is the number of coyotes at breeding. Okay, if we hunted these coyotes very hard, say we killed off 50% of them, we could keep them at bay at a lower percentage throughout the year. But as soon as we stop hunting, those populations bounce back up, especially if we're hunting at an even greater rate. Say we're taking quite a few of these animals out from our area. As soon as we stop hunting or that control, those populations bounce right back up. Okay. Also, this kind of shows the age of these coyotes based on how we deal with them, and oftentimes as we get rid of them or hunt them, what we're doing is we're not necessarily shifting the overall numbers, but sometimes we are just changing the demographics of these animals to be a younger group of coyotes. Some other predators that we have are raptors and ravens. Oftentimes we don't think of ravens, but with newly born kid goats and lambs, sometimes these ravens will fly down and they'll peck at the eyes of the lambs. And so if there isn't a mother that's confident, sometimes that can be of issue. So when you are lambing and kidding out on even a pasture, ravens could be something that you may need to look for. Okay, so these are all a lot of really good examples of large operations that maybe are out on range land, the kind of operations you may see as you're hiking up in the Uintas in the summer. But what is changing in Utah currently, and really across the nation, is that there's an increase in the number of small farms. So every 5 years, there's a really more in-depth ag census that tries to quantify how many animals there are, the size of farms, things like that. But from 2002 to 2017, the number of farms that we now consider small, and some of these we would call maybe a ranchette or a small homestead or something like that, that many of us would like to have and live on, ranging from 1 to 9 acres, these numbers have increased in Utah. From 2012 to 2017, we've seen a 68% increase. That's quite a bit, okay? So what's happening is where things are becoming more urbanized, and in some reflections, it said that for every acre of development, there are roughly 20 acres of rangeland or rural development lost due to it being disconnected or other things like that. So this is kind of how we need to start thinking to some extent on how we're managing our animals. In urban areas, one of the biggest issues is dogs, okay? Neighborhood dogs, stray dogs, if you live in an area that may have a lot of stray dogs. And oftentimes, these dogs are not going about wanting to kill and consume these animals. Oftentimes, it's that prey drive that kicks in, and they will, sometimes maul these animals, and oftentimes it seems like they're having a pretty good time doing it, right? But nonetheless, it's our job as producers to help protect our livestock, whether they're chickens or sheep or goats or something else. Some other predators specifically for poultry that I think about, here we have a nice little dog chasing some poultry. My aunt growing up had a Chihuahua that did a pretty good job killing quite a bit of our poultry also. We have hawks, okay? Even in urban areas, hawks do really well, and some owls. Raccoons that are known to be in urban areas also have great dexterity in their hands, and oftentimes are able to unlatch coops in clever ways, or reach through chicken wire that isn't quite as tight. And then also, if you have small openings throughout your coop or something like that, you may be dealing with issues like snakes. Where I live currently, there's a mink farm not too far away, so that's been in the back of my mind of how can I change my chicken coop to help protect if there was an escapee mink from that farm, okay? So there are kind of two ways now. Let's talk about the management side of it. There are two kind of ways. One being lethal control, right? Trapping, hunting. A lot of this goes to more conventional agriculture maybe. But one thing that we can do very easily, and I'll spend our time on now moving forward, is non-lethal control, okay? So there are a bunch of different things we can do. Fencing, night corrals, shed lambing, keeping them in the barn at night, guard animals, maybe some frightening devices, coop design specific to deal with certain predators that you have may encountered already. So with that, some of the things that we may do is I've heard of things as simple as hanging CDs from a line that may deter some animals, or putting up fake owls to deter some raptors or other predators. Something as simple as in an area, maybe you have a small pasture that you have some sheep or goats in, something as simple as maybe parking a truck or an unfamiliar car nearby may work for a couple nights to deter predators. In this situation, a larger operation, we see that they're doing night. They've set up a night corral where the sheep sleep in a electric fence through the night with the guard dogs on the perimeter. Okay, flaggery is another one that is being used. These flags waving in the wind will deter predators for a certain amount of time. So there's a lot of kind of different things you can do. Some may be more anecdotally successful than others, but nonetheless, the more tools we have in our toolbox, the more things that we can experiment with and hopefully try to reduce any kind of loss. Okay. Talking about coop design for our chickens, I threw up actually a picture of my coop I built this summer. One, that I'm proud of it, and then two, that we can critique it and be fairly harsh on it. Okay, so some of the things that we may want to think about when we're designing a coop for predators and trying to keep them out. Generally, I like the rule of thumb: if your animals, the harder it is for animals to get out, is generally the harder it is for predators to get in, okay? One thing that you can do is around the base of your coop, or chicken run, you dig a roughly 12 to 16-inch hole, and you bury in, you know, 1.5 feet or so of hardware cloth. And what this allows you to do is allows you to, you know, prevent maybe a dog that would come and try to dig underneath the coop to get in. Having some hardware cloth or something that they could not dig through allows some prevention there. Making sure that there's no small holes for predators to get through, thinking about snakes, weasels, minks, maybe even rats, things like that. And this also goes into that biosecurity, right? Dr. Frame talked to us about trying to, you know, keep out, you know, different wild fowl and things like that that could potentially spread some of that risk of the avian flu or other diseases. Okay, and so in our coop, we do have hardware cloth across the whole thing, so it's a little bit more impenetrable than if I was to just use the chicken wire. Okay, also, I don't have a skirt around mine currently, so if an animal, you know, like my neighbor's dog next door was to get in, and I've seen the way he looks at my chickens, he would probably come in and get them. He could probably dig under this coop fairly easy right now. So that's something that I need to do better on. Okay. When thinking about owls or hawks, maybe use a netting, like someone mentioned in our poultry talk earlier that they use netting over their run. Okay. You can also see in this winter picture, this was just taken, you know, just the other day with this big snowstorm that we got. So I thought you guys would think that was interesting. I definitely need to winterize my coop a little bit. Another thing that you can do, say you are letting your chickens out into a fairly large run or a large yard that doesn't have netting over it or anything like that. One thing to think about is if you have chickens that are like to fly up, you know, a little bit higher on fences or over fences, is actually use a management practice of wing clipping. Now, this doesn't hurt the animals, and I grew up doing this a lot, but what you're essentially doing is you're just clipping along these primary feathers, okay? And it helps keep these chickens from flying very high or very far, okay? This would need to be repeated after each molt when they do, you know, molt their feathers and grow them back. But if it keeps them in a fairly confined place that we know the dogs can't get into, it helps keep them out of those areas. Another thing that I don't have listed on here that I really liked Dr. Frame bringing up is using some divergent feeding methods. So maybe you feed in one area so that predators can't get in that area, or maybe you pick up feed at night so that you're not attracting rats or other animals to come into the coop at times when you're not there. Okay. Some other ways of non-lethal control are guard animals, and this is a very successful way to go about things. So if you have sheep or goats, oftentimes people will introduce, maybe they'll graze with a larger animal like a cow, okay? Or maybe they'll buy a donkey, or maybe their horse does a great job at protecting from predators, okay? Llamas are another one. And these are all really good because for the most part, llamas, donkeys, cows, they eat the same thing as our sheep and goats, right? So management wise, it doesn't seem that much more difficult or harder. So, and they can do a real good job. One thing I would advise against is oftentimes I see people get a llama to help protect their flock. And when they get 2 llamas, generally llamas like to do llama stuff, and sometimes they don't do a good job protecting sheep if there's multiple llamas. Now, the word is still out for alpacas. I've recently talked to some producers, and there's some research showing that alpacas may guard a little bit better in multiples than llamas do, but it's something that would still need to be looked into a little bit more. Okay, so maybe multi-species grazing in combination with an electric fence or a guard dog, or multiple of these tools, that non-lethal control tools that we have, can sometimes be very effective. Okay. Probably what I would consider the most effective is a dog. Okay. For sheep and goats, especially. When we think about dogs with chickens, this can also be really good, right? One thing that I would, I guess, caution us against after talking about biosecurity a little bit is that sometimes dogs or cats can interact with other wildlife and bring in diseases from those other wildlife, right? And so if you're really concerned about biosecurity, that could be a thought, but do the benefits outweigh the cons there? So one of the things that is a benefit is that guard dogs do really good job. Okay. They're really good at preventing predators from coming in or protecting our animals altogether. But they generally need a lot of training, right? There needs to be time put into those animals so that they can be the most effective they are. And their feeding requirements are different. Dogs don't eat grass and hay like our sheep and goats do. And so that adds another management step that you may have not thought of prior. Okay. Here is kind of a graph showing some 1980 studies with dogs and without dogs on across operations, either open range or fenced pastures, which some of us may be using here. But overall, you can see that those operations that did not have dogs had greater loss of their animals. Okay. And so dogs overall just do a really great job at protecting, especially some of our small ruminant animals, and also with our poultry to some extent. One thing that, if we're talking poultry, is sometimes we think about, well, maybe we have a rooster with our hens to help protect or take on a predator if it has to. And yes, this can work, but many of us also may live in cities or towns that will let you raise hens, but may not let you raise a rooster, right? And so roosters come with their own set of challenges. Maybe you're thinking about a goose, a larger type of animal. Again, we start thinking about biosecurity as far as, that avian flu, as far as it being more transmissible in waterfowl, right? So, and not necessarily mixing flocks as much as kind of what, Dr. Frame was talking about. So there's a lot of ways to think about this, and, maybe you find something that works best for you. But yeah, there's just a lot of things to think about. One thing though, if you're going to use dogs, one of the other cons of dogs is in large situations, dogs may wander a lot. So a lot of my producers that are on rangeland, they have to think about their dogs wandering into campsites or hiking trails as we're sharing this space out in the wilderness. But in town, if you have a dog, how aggressive is your dog? If it was to interact with another individual or get out, would it be overly aggressive? So there's a really good balance of how protective we want our dog to be. Another one is that there's kind of been this trend lately, and I don't think this would be so true in the urban farm side of things, but dogs that sometimes wander away from their flocks are sometimes taken. And sometimes this is done out of, being naive to what that dog's job is, or sometimes I think it's done somewhat maliciously, right? But nonetheless, these dogs have a very important job in order to protect these animals from the predators that are out there. I like to advise people that if they're going to have dogs, please get them into your veterinarian, make sure that they have they're microchipped. So if they are lost or someone has taken them, that they can be returned at a later date, or at bare minimum, at least tag them so that people can read on the tag to know that they belong and that they have a certain job to do. Overall, I think there are a lot of really good things that we can do, non-lethal types of predation deterrent and prevention or management, just in how we build our coops in the back of our yard, or maybe we know that there's issues with raccoons in our neighborhood. These are all good things to think about, and what tools do we have in our toolbox in order to answer these questions. So I guess with that, I'm kind of wrapping it up. If you have any questions, feel free to go ahead and ask me some of those questions. I think Jake had
Yeah.
filled. You want to field some of those?
Yeah, so you got a couple questions here already. The first question, this isn't necessarily a predator, but I have an issue with rats digging underneath my coop. My coop is mobile, so hardware underneath isn't an option. I'm worried about raccoons digging because of the compromised holes the rats have made. Any good trap or extermination ideas for rats?
Oh, I mean, I guess when I'm thinking, I know a lot of people who do chicken tractors like this, and I think this is a really growing part of kind of backyard poultry and backyard chickens, is to have some of these mobile coops or chicken tractors that we like to call them. Some of my friends actually do put some hardware cloth underneath that could help in prevention. But if getting rid of these rats is a big issue, there's a couple ways to look at it. You can look at it as like the lethal option of mechanical, control of maybe you do set some traps and bait these animals in to get rid of them, or maybe a biological control. Maybe you have a barn cat that's able to hunt these, or maybe even a small terrier. Your friend down the street has a terrier that you could utilize, and there are some of those options. But ultimately, I think a combination of those things is best. Rats specifically, you might want to start looking around your area of what other food sources are available around that are keeping a large population of rats or rodents around your operation. Make sure things are sealed up tight, and that hopefully that chicken coop isn't their only source, and so make them not want to stay around your operation as much. And I don't know if that's the best answer, and I think that's a really hard question to answer, but I hope that helps. So.
All right, another question here. The local chapter of the Audubon Society in neighboring Elko County, Nevada, believes great horned owls are the largest predator of domestic pets in Elko County. Coyotes were previously assumed to be responsible, but closed circuit security cameras are disproving their responsibility. Is predation by owls included in your stats for eagles, or have owls been largely ignored in Utah?
Yeah, so when that stats where we in 2010 it showed you the percentage of predation on sheep, owls would have been thrown into that raptor category with eagles, red-tailed eagles, bald eagles, all the kind of avian species that we deal with. And so the problem is, and I talked to Dr. Frame about this and some other extension agents, of where can we find stats that actually show accurate stats on some of these species with backyard poultry, and that is very difficult to find any of that, let alone what does poultry cost if you were to show that, hey, this was killed by a coyote or an owl. What is your chicken worth? If we went off KSL or Craigslist, we could guess that chickens right now are selling for laying hens $25 to $50. However, how many months of feed have you put into raising that $2.50 chick all the way into a laying hen? And calculating that cost would, I think, shock some of us. Nonetheless, we do it probably because we love it more so than it's an economical benefit. More so now than ever, though. If you're getting eggs, I hope you're benefiting from that. So
perfect. Okay, one last quick question. Are you aware there are a lot of hunters that hunt coyotes because Utah has a $50 bounty on them? I don't know if you knew that or not.
Yeah. I had a lot of friends when I was going to school up in Idaho during my undergraduate, quite some years ago now, it seems like, but they would come down to Utah just to hunt coyotes for the weekend. And some of them actually made some pretty good money over the course of a weekend. As far as we're talking wildlife services from the federal government, and I know our current governor is trying to put more state management or funding into wildlife services to help with predation across the state, so that the federal government isn't so responsible for it. But currently the federal government every year has cut more and more funding to wildlife services. And so I think as producers, it becomes more and more our responsibility of how we're going to manage for predators, or how much input we're going to be put into dealing with predators. And unfortunately, in the industry I work with, sheep and goats, it has actually driven quite a few large producers out of the industry just because it is overwhelming sometimes too much. Interestingly, we've been doing some stuff with some wild horses over near the Nevada border. And some sheep producers there actually say that wild horses, especially the stallions that are very territorial, will sometimes kill more sheep in a year than coyotes do. So sheep and goats, they need our protection, and so do all our backyard animals like our rabbits and our poultry. So it's just something to think about. So thank you.